Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk again to Emir. You're most welcome, sir.
Hello again.
Hello again. For those who don't remember, Emir holds a BA in Islamic theology and a BA in German linguistics and literature and Islamic religious education from the University of Osnabrück in Germany, where he is. And today I'm in France. So this is a Franco-German production today. After completing a master's in Islamic studies and history at the University of Oxford in 2022, he is now pursuing a second master's in comparative literature and critical translation at the same university. His research interests include rational theology, ilm al-kalam, as it's known in Arabic, German thought, intellectual exchanges between East and West, and the reception of Islamic thought and literature among thinkers of the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment. Today, in part 2, we continue discussing Immanuel Kant in the Muslim world and the history of causality. We'll come to that in a second, what that means in East and West, and also Muslim scholarship in conversation with modern European philosophy, with particular focus on the work of noted Muslim thinker Sheikh al-Islam Mustafa Sabri Effendi. So, Emir, over to you.
Thank you very much. In this hopefully manageable session, I just wanted to focus on a few points we didn't get talked to in the last session. And we will just finish the philosophical context by understanding the importance of the question of causality. And then we'll quickly move on to the historical context by summarizing Sabri's life and times and his major work, which will be also like the reference work of our whole conversation. So in other words, like this second talk should rather be considered as the second part of the first talk, so that we can go over to the more philosophical and more systematic discussion in our third round. Right. As for the importance of the question of causality, so we have mentioned a lot of thinkers, a lot of theologians, a lot of philosophers, and the question arises, like, why does causality matter to all of these names in the first place? So what's the main problem, so to say? Because everybody drinks water in order to quench his thirst. So the whole topic sounds, at least at the first glance, not very reasonable. But the crux of the matter is that causality is not an observation. Causality is an interpretation. Means that we have, like we always have three pictures. So we have fire and cotton. Cotton comes closer to fire and gets burned. And we unconsciously connect these pictures and say cotton was burned because of fire. But the only thing we can see is a kind of conjunction, a ma'iyya, as it is called in Arabic, a witness. Our senses can't tell us anything about causality per se. So in other words, like the question of whether things that we can see have a causal efficacy is not an empirical question. It is rather a metaphysical one. Right. And this changes the whole dynamics, because regardless of which theory one subscribes to, as soon as someone talks about causation, that A is the cause or the reason for B, he goes beyond that what the eye can see. And just to give maybe an example, Aristotle famously contends that every physical object is a compound of non-physical matter and form, right? And it sounds very intuitive that he says, like, every physical object has an intrinsic nature. So when a seed becomes a tree, it is because of the nature of the seed. It can't become anything else. And when fire burns, it is because of the nature of fire. But if we just pause a moment and ask ourselves, from where do you get this nature and this, let's say, combination of matter and form and all of these, let's say, assumptions, he can't, or nobody can give us an empirical answer, because these things are not empirically validated in the first place. And this is actually the reason why Hume, for example, as a radical empiricist, has no concept of causation whatsoever. So he says there's nothing to be gained to attribute causation to an, let's say, internal factor like nature. And there's also nothing to be gained when you attribute it to an external factor like God. And Hume is just a sharp observer and says, only empirical evidence matters to me. And causality, that's obviously like subject to discussion, but causality in the final analysis can't have empirical evidence. So the point is to say that occasionalism is not very intuitive, for example, is not an argument at all, because all causal theories at the end of the day are in desperate need of philosophical justification. Since logically speaking, there is an unbridgeable gap between constant conjunction on the one hand and causation on the other. So one can't just assume that only because one thing starts to exist after the other, one thing comes after the other, it comes because of the other. Because
the correlation is not the same as cause. Correlation is not the same as cause. The two things are juxtaposed or in conjunction with each other, but that doesn't necessarily therefore imply causation. That's a different matter.
Right. So we just can't equate correlation with causation. And a famous example is actually like in the Middle Ages, people thought that lightning is the cause of thunder, which makes sense, right? Because we always see lightning first and then the thunder. But modern science tells us, and we don't have to go into its detail, that there's an, let's say, electrical discharge between clouds and so on and so forth, which is to say that the correlation of two things does not amount to a causal relationship. And even if we were to say this, namely that effect B is the result of cause A, we still have to ask ourselves other questions. For example, is it only because of A? Like, is A the only cause of B? Or do we have other causes as well? For example, divine causation. And another question would be then, what is actually the relationship between them? Is God the one who gives cause A its power, its causal efficacy? And if the answer is yes, can he take it back? So, and if God is even able to take this causal efficacy back, like, why should we assume that he has given this power in the first place? As Ghazali says, for example, in his Ihya, like, فَلِمَ لَا يُحَالُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ أَوَّلِ الْأَمْرِ. What prevents us to attribute real causal efficacy directly and solely to God? Like, is God in need of this chain? That's basically the question at stake.
And of course, Al-Ghazali, the great Islamic theologian, he was an occasionalist himself, so he believed...
Right.
Yeah, okay, just to clarify.
Like, that's the dominant way of how he was received, and that's the dominant way of how he was understood throughout Islamic history, correct? And another very important question in this context is obviously the question of necessity. So is this connection that we have established between cause A and effect B, is that logically necessary? Means, is it absurd to say that we won't see the effect as soon as we see the cause? Is it as absurd to say that this won't happen? Like, we say the whole is not greater than its part, because the second sentence, the second statement we have made, is obviously logically inconceivable. We can't make a concept out of this. And Hume and Sabri will say, as we will see in the third round, that it is always possible to conceive one event without the other, without any contradiction. And therefore, Sabri Effendi concludes from this, it is also logically not inconceivable to to believe that Sayyidina Ibrahim, for example, was thrown into the fire but was not burnt. So this understanding has huge implications for scripture and for the interpretation.
That story is about Abraham in the Quran, isn't it? It's not found in the Bible
in the Quran. I'm not sure whether it's found in the Bible, but we can also take other mutual examples or mutual miracles.
Clarifying the source of that story, which is in
the concept is still the same. Yep. Namely the concept of miracles. And that's actually the reason why Imam al-Ghazali discusses this very topic, the topic of causality, in his famous Tahafut, in his famous incoherence of the philosophers. He even says in the beginning that the philosophers, above all, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, makes no room for miracles. And therefore he has to basically refute them on this point. And 9 centuries later, interestingly, Mustafa Sabri Effendi engages in very similar terms against modernists, because they also start to interpret miracles away. So there's a very similar discussion going on, and I would even say this topic is timeless. So
this is the irony. You call them modernists, but you've just clearly demonstrated these ideas are extremely old and anything but modern. And modern, actually, these are very old-fashioned ideas that keep on recycling themselves.
Yeah. Right, and it's, as I said, actually quite timeless. So even nowadays, if there is a kind of discussion on this, one has to ask maybe his opponent on what basis he is denying miracles if he says so. So, because as soon as one says miracles are impossible, he issues a metaphysical judgment.
Absolutely.
And the reason is because impossibility cannot be found in nature. And this is exactly the discussion that takes place between Sabri Effendi and the empiricists on the other hand, Locke and Mill and so on and so forth. He says empirical evidence can only tell us what is or what has happened, meaning it is retrospective and it is an assertion. But from empirical evidence, you can't derive what must be, meaning necessity, or what cannot be, meaning impossibility, because this is beyond the scope of empirical science.
Yes, and this is where you're talking about the philosophy of science is so important in actually uncovering the assumptions and the metaphysical background, which is perhaps often invisible to at first glance of many of these statements. They're not kind of neutral objective. They come from an assumption about the nature of reality, which the philosophy of science can make explicit and critique and open for discussion and maybe even to refute.
And I would say thus we come closer to our topic, because the nature of causality and the causality principle, the principle of sufficient reason, is in the center of the discussion. Does it have empirical elements? Is it purely rational, or in Kant's terms, a priori? That's the question at stake. By the way, I've realized that I haven't recommended anything yet in terms of literature. There's actually not much scholarship done on Mustafa Sabri Effendi, unfortunately, but much less in English actually. But one interesting article would be the one written by Faruk Terzic, a Bosnian scholar, I think, from Pakistan or from the University of Islamabad. He has written an article on prophethood and miracles in the understanding of Mustafa Sabri Effendi. That's quite recommendable, I would say.
Is that in English or in?
That's in English, yeah. That's the only reason why I mentioned it. And as these kind of points imply, there's actually hardly any subject in which the question of causality does not play a major role. I mean, when we talk about causality, we are talking about the very way God relates to the world and to us. So therefore, any possible answer pertains to areas like, first and foremost, theology. What does it mean that we have an omnipotent God, that he's also omnipresent and even omniscient, right? And especially since all three monotheistic religions do reject an understanding of a distant God who's not engaged with the world in the first place. A second topic would be ontology, because the question of do things have a causal efficacy or not, meaning, or do they have a nature, is an ontological question. And epistemology is obviously also like in the equation, because the question of how, like the question is, how can we know what the true cause of something is? And therefore, we are talking about metaphysics, which is basically made up of ontology and epistemology. Another question, as we said, is the question of moral philosophy, which we are not going to delve into, but like every causal theory basically deals with the felt freedom of human beings. The Ash'ari have their Casp theory, other theories do have other like explanations, but as we said, like we have to come to terms with the fact that there is no easy answer to this. And even Kant, because he will be in the center of our discussion, says after he has explained after he has given his solution, he, for example, also says like that his explanation is quite dark, like dunkel. And
is that the word you said the word in German then, dunkel? It sounds like the English word dark. Is that the same?
Yeah, right.
Opaque, hard to little light about the subject. Is that
right? And he even says, is there a lighter explanation? Is there even a more comprehensible explanation? Because my explanation, you might find it dark, you might find it very difficult to understand. But I couldn't even find anything better than the one I have presented to you as his like solution. So, which is to say that the theories do grapple with this question. But another, maybe to give another example, what might be what is pertained by the question of causality, like the discipline of logic, because Aristotle said like natural necessity, he basically equated natural necessity to logical necessity, and this was a valid basis for demonstrative syllogisms in his understanding. And occasionalism actually demolished this idea completely and paved the way for modern philosophy in this way. So it is said that Hume couldn't have existed in this manner if there was not any occasionalist questioning in the first place. So, and another very important topic, which will play a central role in our discussion as well, is the topic of the possibility and predictability of sciences. This is the topic in which Kant tries to overcome Hume. But like the connection is very obvious, like just to in order to remember maybe just the traditional definition of knowledge, true justified belief, right? Wahrer gerechtfertigter Glaube. It's, I think, in German, I think it's actually in every language more or less the same. So in Arabic we say jazmun mutabiqun lil waqi' an dalil. So it's basically the same. We have two components, like it has to be true and it has to be justified. Justified means you have to have reasons. And this is basically causality. And therefore, Mustafa Sabri Effendi, by the way, says, like when he talks about the principle of causality, he says, وَجَمِيعُ الْعُلُومِ مَدِينٌ لِمَبْدَئِ الْعِلِّيَّةِ, and all sciences, let's say, are grounded on the principle of sufficient reason, on the principle of causality. لِأَنَّ الْعِلْمَ مَعْرِفَةُ الشَّيْءِ بِسَبَبِهِ, because knowledge is to know something with its reason. So the connection is actually quite obvious. And to sum this up, like the point is, we have very compelling reasons to have a clear opinion about the topic of causality, and also Sabri Effendi had a clear stance on this. And maybe the most important reason was that he was an Asharite theologian, and this kind of rationalist tradition considers first principles, like the principle of sufficient reason or the principle of non-contradiction, to be the foundation of human knowledge, because they are epistemological realists, and the unconditional acceptance of these kind of laws of thought, as they are called, constitute an indispensable precondition for the possibility of science in general, and obviously for metaphysics as a science, which is the question at stake.
Can I just add a footnote here? I don't want to digress as a subject at all, but I just want to, perhaps an observation of mine. There is certain knowledge, Islamically speaking, of things without sufficient reason given from our point of view, that nevertheless we accept as certain and true and real knowledge. For example, we are told that the existence of angels, the day of judgment, the unseen, the ghaib, that we, and this is certain knowledge. Yaqeen, in the beginning of Surah Baqarah in the Quran, talks about, that this book is for those that have certainty about the unseen. So that there are vast areas of actual knowledge of the unseen that are not open to questions of causality and so on, but we simply take them on trust, if that's the right word, because they come from revelation. And I don't want to digress at all from what you're saying. I just wanted to kind of just mention that category of knowledge which is not open to this kind of rationalistic discourse and elucidation in that way. There are many other examples, like, why do Muslims pray a certain number of rak'ah in, Maghrib prayer rather than Fajr prayer and so on. We don't know why, but these are the given realities based on God's will, I suppose.
Right. Just as a quick addition, the category you have mentioned regarding angels and the day of judgment and any other metaphysical reality, they are actually called in Kalamic, like in the Kalamic terminology, they are called sam'iyat, so things we have heard and things we have to believe in. Yet, and that's, I think, a very important distinction to make, because the Kalamic tradition has an integrative understanding, or like integrationist understanding, about religion and reason. So there's nothing in religion which is logically inconceivable or incomprehensible, even if we don't have like empirical sciences or any other tool to access that knowledge. The things we are believing are still logically reasonable things. And in this case, it's not something absurd, not at all. And their truthfulness is actually established by the truthfulness of scripture. That would be the Kalamic way of dealing with things, saying that because the Quran is true, all the things that is contended, like that the Quran contains, are also true.
Okay.
But to come back to the topic, because the principle of causality is such central, Sabri perceives Kant's radical restriction of this very principle to the appearances, let's say to the physical world for now, as an acute danger to metaphysics, and especially to the cosmological argument, as we know. So, in other words, like the possibility of metaphysics is also tied to the question of causality, since Kant is known for having destroyed traditional metaphysics. And Sabri sees that and says something like, this game is basically not over.
I just want to stress here, sorry to interrupt again, but I used to think, until I knew better, that Kant was an atheist. He certainly wasn't an atheist, and he mentions in the Critique of Pure Reason and elsewhere, he definitely believed in God, and he had his own reasons to believe in the existence of a transcendent mind-independent deity. But it's just, particularly in the Critique of Pure Reason, the traditional arguments adduced by people like St. Thomas Aquinas in the Catholic tradition, and going back, of course, to Aristotle before him, those particular arguments, the ontological argument or cosmological argument and so on, they are critiqued and seemed to be wanting, but that doesn't mean he's an atheist. He's not. He believes in God in the traditional sense. He might not have done. There were contemporaries of his who were apparently atheists, Enlightenment thinkers, although there weren't many of them. Hume, perhaps, although you might disagree, perhaps I think he is an atheist. But so there were people. He did have that option philosophically if he needed to find allies, but he chose to remain a theist, very much so.
Yes, and that's actually a very important point, because this is one of the driving forces of Kant's theoretical philosophy, namely the rescue of moral values. So, and there is a kind, as you have implied, there's a kind of discrepancy between Kant's self-depiction, self-understanding, and his reception, because he's to be known to have paved the way for, let's say, quite atheistic understandings. And Sabri sees that and is actually wants to basically grounds even some, let's say, strategic arguments against the followers of Kant in Egypt by saying Kant was actually not an atheist as you are, while you are constantly referring to him. So he sees that and tries to mobilize this argument for his own intentions. So, but I would say let's do a cut here, and I think that's enough of a philosophical context, and maybe a few remarks would be also quite helpful regarding the historic background regarding Sabri's intellectual biography.
Yes. So Sabri Effendi, when was he born? Where was he born? When did he die? And who was he?
So Sabri Effendi was born in 1869 in Tokat, that's in north-central Anatolia, today's Turkey, and started to study there and in Kayseri, which is also in Anatolia, and then moved to Istanbul. And it goes without saying that he was highly successful in mastering all the Islamic disciplines, and especially the rational science, logic and kalam, and usul fiqh, so the so-called aqliyat. So much so that the famous scholar of that time, Ahmed Asim Effendi, who was one of his main teachers and who was the scholar responsible for the famous Huzur dersleri, which I will come back in a second, wanted to have him as a member of his family and married him to his own daughter.
Wow. Yeah.
So, but just to quickly mention what the Huzur dersleri are, they are called, I think, the Imperial Presence Lectures in English, institutionalized in 1758. And this is actually, if not the most scholarly, most prestigious scholarly circle in the Ottoman Empire. The most known and the most representative 100 scholars of the empire are called in Ramadan to discuss religious matters in the presence of the Sultan, and therefore they are called presence lectures. And Sabri marries at the age of 23 the daughter of the scholar who's responsible for this very gathering, meaning he's the one who's responsible for deciding who's actually a senior scholar in this whole empire, which is quite telling, obviously. But before that, in 1890, Sabri obtains the so-called Ru'us Tedris when he's 21. This is the highest certificate for Islamic education, and he becomes a lecturer in the famous Fatih Mosque, in the Sahne Saman Mosque in Istanbul.
Which I was in I think just over a couple of months ago.
Yes.
It's a stunning building. If you've not been there, do go to Istanbul and visit some of the world's most amazing buildings.
Right. And throughout his teaching, Sabri gives more than 50 ijazat, and at 28 he himself joins this circle actually. So, and he's the youngest scholar in this very circle, and still is able to attract the attention of the Sultan, who is at that time none other than the famous Sultan Abdul Hamid II. And Sultan Abdul Hamid wants to appreciate the scholarship of this young man and takes him as the caretaker of his private library. So, and the list of academic successes, like the positions, the medals, the publications, the societies, goes on and on. Maybe one last thing that should be briefly mentioned is that in 1918, Sabri becomes, when he's like around 50, becomes the chief or the main professor of the Sulaymaniya Darul Hadith Madrasa, which is, in terms of religious education, just the highest institute in the whole empire. And that's also the time, like, I think a few months after that, he also will become the Shaykh al-Islam, which is an official title, means that he's the chief jurisconsult and the, let's say, most authoritative scholar in the whole empire, which is to say that this is basically the, let's say, one of the best products this intellectual environment could have produced in that time.
So to clarify, the Ottoman Empire, of course, existed at that time, and it came to an end in 1923 when what is called today the Republic of Turkey came into being. Dealing here with the political entity, the Ottoman Empire, that preceded the contemporary Turkish Republic.
Right. And Sabri's life is closely tied to this transition as well, because he has a second identity, which makes him a complicated figure, namely his political career. So next to being a scholar, a librarian, and a journalist, he also will get involved into politics and will become a parliamentarian. And he will get into a lot of trouble. But
he reminds me of another figure, similar and different, Ibn Taymiyyah, who also was similarly astonishingly brilliant from extremely young age, highly regarded by many of his scholarly contemporaries, but also became a political figure, very much so, with the Mughal invasion and so on, and got into trouble as well with the authorities. But anyway, a complex figure politically, religiously. There are differences, of course, with Effendi, but nevertheless, these two figures remind me of each other in some ways.
Yeah, and I mean, it's always a difficult relationship between the ulama and the umara, as we say, right? Like between the politicians and the scholars. And it is not necessarily very important to our discussion. Therefore, I would love to maybe skip this identity of his. Maybe to mention one thing, because a lot of people don't know this actually, like, although Mustafa Kemal Pasha, more known as Atatürk, with whom Sabri is, amongst others, at odds with,
sorry, just to make clear to everyone, he's a founder, or understood popularly to be the founder of modern Turkey, a controversial figure in some circles. But anyway, he's, if you go to Turkey, go to Istanbul, other cities, you'll see his image, statues, pictures all over the place.
Because he's the of this republic, yes, right. And Mustafa Kemal Pasha himself granted Sabri a pardon in 1938, but still Sabri refused to come back. He was in exile in that time and stayed in Egypt until his death. And this was actually also the time in which he produced his major works, above all, Mawqif al-Aql, this one here, which is also our reference work.
Right.
And which is basically a volume of, like a 4-volume critique of mostly current Islamic and European theological and philosophical trends. And this is precisely what I care about, at least. Like, rather than Mustafa Sabri Effendi as a politically controversial figure, I'm more interested in the traditionally trained Asharite theologian. And this second identity of his is clearly overshadowed by his first one, which is a shame, because he has much to offer. And therefore, it should be as unproblematic to study his Kalam scholarship as the scholarship of any other theologian. And we should be able to differentiate between his politics and his scholarship, as we do with a lot of figures, by the way. Like, just to give a very controversial name, I mean, Luther, highly regarded theologian, has quite interesting, to say the least, like stances on Muslims and Jews, right?
Whenever an academic says the word interesting in association with a figure, you know this is a massive euphemism. Martin Luther, of course, is famous for kickstarting the Reformation in Germany, which spread everywhere else. And he's highly revered still amongst many, many Christians in the United States and elsewhere. Indeed, a whole church was founded in his name, the Lutheran Church. But he was also incredibly politically active, and he incited or encouraged the political powers of the day, the princes, to put down the peasants' revolt at that time, resulting in great bloodshed. And also he was viciously anti-Semitic. And that's even an understatement. If you read what he says about the Jewish people, it's quite extraordinarily vicious and nasty. And indeed, the National Socialists in Germany cited him in justification for their own attitudes towards the Jews. Nevertheless, I think the point you're making, despite his forays into anti-Semitism and political reactionary campaigning, you can still look at Martin Luther in terms of his theology as a Christian theologian and as a thinker, as a reformer in his own right. His biblical commentaries, his theology, his preaching, his hymn making are taken on their own terms today without any feeling of awkwardness. Oh, well, he was a vicious anti-Semite, and, he was instrumental in killing lots of peasants. You can do that. And that's quite acceptable, it seems, in the West. You can have this compartmentalization where you kind of bracket out this stuff. So you're saying, okay, we do that with Martin Luther. Maybe we can, I'm not in any way imputing anything horrible, of course, to Sabri Effendi, but we can compartmentalize his life and thought in a way that has a precedent.
Maybe a kind of remarkable anecdote. In one interreligious dialogue we had here in Cologne, in Köln, like the rabbi turned to the Protestant theologian, saying to him, and the context was basically the Nazi regime and how the church has behaved in that very time. Like, he actually was quite clear, saying to him that the Nazis didn't misuse Luther, they only have used them.
Yes, they're delighted, the Nazi newspaper delighted in quoting great sermons of Martin Luther. You Google it, I don't want to dwell on Martin Luther, but if you Google Martin Luther and the Jews, you can read his stuff in translation. It is extraordinarily vicious and as unparalleled. And he drew on early fathers of the church, Chrysostom and others, who are also viciously anti-Semite as well. Anti-Semitism is a Christian virus. Historically, unfortunately, has infected other people than other religions to some extent, but it is a Christian virus, and it's only after, of course, the Holocaust that Christians have begun to take this seriously as a problem, and the reckoning has happened, of course, since 1945. Anyway, diversion from much more.
My point is basically to say, like, we are talking about Sabri's theology on blogging theology, and that should be perfectly fine.
That's more than enough for me.
Especially since, to be perfectly frank, like, if we are able to discuss Kant's philosophy, despite his disgusting attitude towards, let's say, 90% of humanity, we are even more entitled to engage with Sabri's theological legacy, even if his political one is somewhat complicated.
I mean, so just a final point. I can't resist this comment. We live in an age where we deplatform people, we censor people, we destroy people's lives based on statements they may have made on Twitter or in books and newspapers in the past. But we're not really yet deplatforming Martin Luther for his vicious anti-Semitism. We're not yet deplatforming, you mentioned Kant, who's still highly regarded, despite his explicitly racist views. He wrote a whole book about his racism. We're not deplatforming Darwin. If you read The Descent of Man, Charles Darwin, the English naturalist, he has some very racist ideas as well. So that, if we were to start deplatforming systematically through the Western tradition, there wouldn't be many people left standing. We could be an empty room with nothing there. It's just if we apply this rigorously through our intellectual tradition, but by our I mean the West, of course, there will be very few figures left who will be even able to read anymore. And I'm not suggesting we go down that path, of course, it's because we need to be more grown up about life and see the good and the bad and accept the good, not accept the bad. Despite our present culture's obsession with deplatforming and destroying people because of remarks they may have made. End of party political broadcast. Sorry, back to you.
No worries at all. And like, just to talk about Sabri's theology or about his work is exactly what I want to do now. Maybe as a last point, just introduce this very work, the motivation behind it, its structure, its sources, and the discussion topics with Kant, so that we have like a good set stage for our next and last meeting. So the full name is موقف العقل والعلم والعالم من رب العالمين وعباده المرسلين. It's alam means world and not alim, which I have heard as well, which basically means scholar. But the whole title means something like the position of reason, knowledge, and the world in regards to the Lord of the worlds and his divinely sent servants, which gives its content away. There is a kind of triangular relationship going on, namely between reason, religion, and science. And Sabri wants to shed light on that from an Islamic perspective. And his aim is to anchor the relationship between these three, let's say, realities in the Kalam paradigm, and wants to show what kind of rightful role every aspect can play. And he has a kind of, let's say, integrationist model, basically a very Ghazalian approach again. If we remember Ghazali's famous work, which is called Qanun al-Ta'wil, that's a kind of epistle where he has also this like integrationist understanding, meaning that he says revelation can never contradict reason. And Sabri just adds one thing, namely empirical science, and wants to show what empirical science is apt for and what not. And maybe that might be also interesting to note, he's therefore not necessarily very happy with the Christian paradigm, which obviously has a kind of independent model between religious truth and reason, like rational truth. And Sabri himself was prompted to write this work by the intellectually challenging environment he found in Egypt, having witnessed the growing positivism, materialism, and thus atheism in Egypt's public and intellectual life. He concluded that the postulated dichotomies between faith, knowledge, and reason could be largely traced back to the detrimental influence of European philosophy and especially of Kant's philosophy, which he then seeks to combat in Mawqif al-Aql. But it is obviously not restricted to Kant. Actually, Mustafa Sabri Effendi, his main interlocutors are not Western philosophers, but the Egyptian intellectuals and the Egyptian scholars. And because the Egyptian modernists were drawing on Western philosophy, he saw the requirement to engage with it. But over the course of his studies of Western philosophy, it became an endeavor of itself. So
he didn't read Kant in the original German, I understand. He read Kant in Arabic as he was discussed and presented in Arabic texts.
Right. Sabri Effendi knew Arabic, Turkish, and Persian, which was like the basic, let's say, education of these scholars. And he didn't know any European language, which basically was a problem insofar as he couldn't access Kant directly or any other European philosopher. But he had, let's say, secondary sources in Arabic and Turkish, and was drawing on them. So another explicit reason, as Sabri mentions, why he has written this work is to defend Kalam and to demonstrate its merits against all the anti-Kalam trends, like a problem that we still have today, I would say, like kind of challenging issue. Also, I have to mention, like, the attitudes of today are a little bit more complex. So we see maybe people who are not very happy with the Kalam tradition, while adopting maybe some Kalam methods from Christian philosophers, but that's another issue. As for its influence, I think it's a bit difficult to assess. Like, the influence is difficult to assess because Mawqif al-Aql was banned in Turkey until the late 1980s, and therefore it is understudied in Turkish academia. We have a few PhD theses, but they are more general on Sabri's thought, but nothing concretely on his engagement with Immanuel Kant, for example. Yet, from what I can see, what made his famous work like also known amongst traditional circles is that major scholars have popularized it. For example, Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, Sheikh Ramadan al-Bouti, who were giants in their fields, or even today, Sheikh Said Fouda or Sheikh Hamza al-Bakri and Sheikh Usama al-Azhari, all of them used to refer to that work, means, which is to say that, and that's at least my impression, that it is somewhat known by larger groups, yet it hasn't been extensively studied. And there's actually another reason why this is the case. It is also not that easy to engage with this work, insofar as every research faces a few challenges, like every research done on Mawqif al-Aql. First, the language. So it is a bit unusual because it's not always very idiomatic. Sabri being a Turk and writing in Arabic is actually obviously something that has implications for his writing itself. But also like just the abstract nature of the content itself is obviously a challenge. And Sabri himself is quite succinct in his references. When he refers to his own tradition, he says, this is the way the mutakallimin will do this, or this is the way how it is in the Kalam tradition and things like that, where you just have to know what he's referring to. So you have to have an understanding of the Kalam tradition itself. And
it's similar to Kant. I mean, Kant is placing himself in a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue with like David Hume, René Descartes, of course. You know, he's not just, you just can't parachute into Kant, I don't think. Well, certainly not for the critic of pure reason. In a way you do, I think, we say Plato's Socratic dialogues. You can read Euthyphro or whatever, and understand them on their own terms. They're quite intelligible and accessible. But Kant, you can't do that. You can't.
Right.
No pun intended. Yeah,
that's correct. That's correct, and it's actually always a question in like Kant scholarship, whom Kant has as an opponent in this very question, for example, or what is Kant referring to when he says this and that, and the same applies more or less to Sabri. In some ways at least, but he's also sometimes a little bit succinct in his critiques. He says he has this general assumption and then the second one, and the third one is actually not reconcilable with the first two ones. So, and then you basically have to understand what he wants to show you or what he wants to tell you. A second topic which makes the whole endeavor a little bit complicated is the structure. It's not a classical Kalam manual. It is not very systematic as we used to have it with regards to other Kalam manuals. It contains a few repetitions, and therefore the work is at times quite laborious to read, which is not very surprising because I think the work somehow reflects the structure, like the structure reflects, or better to say, the structure reflects its turbulent times, the turbulent context in which Sabri has written this very work. So one big task is to systematize Sabri's edifice of thought, because in the final analysis, we are talking about a kind of refutation by an angry man against a whole list of thinkers. He has a lot of intellectual fronts and is therefore quite polemical and apologetic.
It reminds me so much of Ibn Taymiyyah. Again, Ibn Taymiyyah was not systematic, I don't think. He wrote piecemeal, ad hoc. You know, the systematizer, our mutual friend, Professor Carl Sherriff, has attempted to systematize Ibn Taymiyyah's thought. But Ibn Taymiyyah had many fronts. He was arguing, polemicizing against people in terms of great political emergency, social dislocation, invasion, the breakdown of society. Again, there's a similar thing that happens in Sabri Effendi's time. So the parallels again are quite interesting. And Kant, though, was a great systematizer. He spent, as we know, his whole life at Königsberg, never went anywhere, never did anything apparently particularly. But constructed these incredible edifices of thought, these architectural wonders, Critic of Pure Reason and so on. Great systematizer. Again, unlike, but a very different political and social context, of great stability and great, so very different.
Yeah. By the way, Kant himself calls his own approach, or his own, let's say, approach as architectonic. Means he calls it like this literally, and one thing that maybe should be noted, even if they have quite a few similarities with regards to their, let's say, biographies, Sabri and Ibn Taymiyyah are not necessarily on the same page, especially with understanding of Kalam.
Absolutely correct. I was suggesting that anyway, obviously one was Ashra, another one was not exactly right. Right, of course. But I was just saying, in terms of the biography and the social political context dynamics, the non-systematic nature of their thought, and the sheer brilliance of their intellects, I can't help. I'm just making comparisons within the Islamic tradition.
Right. Which is a very, I think, insightful one at the same time. And we already have mentioned how Sabri has accessed Western philosophy. This is a third point. So. And I have to confess, in the beginning, it made me suspicious, whether he did not misunderstand many things. But Sabri Effendi seems to have, I would say, a well-informed overview of the Western philosophers through his sources, and a good grasp of their positions. It's maybe not very detailed in every aspect, but there was not one instance, not one passage where I had the impression that he just got it wrong. This applies to Descartes, to Berkeley, to Locke, to Mill, to Hume, to Kant, and also to Auguste Comte, who's also a main interlocutor of his. So he understands their positions and is able to locate them in the grand scheme of things, which is his big achievement. Yet, and I have to say that very explicitly, it is still not the case that Mustafa Sabri Effendi has basically given us a full-fledged account on every aspect. The work remains to be systematized, and I would be more than happy if one of all the people I know, or even those I don't know, who are much more senior than me in scholarship and wisdom, and who are much more qualified than me.
You're too modest. Why not maybe one day yourself?
Maybe as a corporation, who knows? But I just wanted to mention that this is a very big job to do, and it needs a lot of, let's say, scholarship and a lot of, let's say, familiarity with both traditions, and requires accordingly
someone just like you, in other words. Yes.
I'm not sure about that, but it needs to be the point is, it needs to be done, especially since there's no doubt that this very work is truly much more substantial than everything that has been written in the name of, let's say, the movement of Ilm al-Kalam al-Jadid, as it is called, the new rational theology, by figures like Shibli Normani and Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan and Muhammad Abduh and Rashid Rida and the like. The list is quite long. In fact, Mustafa Sabri Effendi is a vocal critic of some of these names, dedicating a considerable amount of his magnum opus to their inconsistencies, which is obviously a very thankless task.
Yes, and doesn't necessarily get you lots of friends either. Like perhaps another person I just mentioned, Ibn Taymiyyah, who was very keen to point out the inconsistencies in other people's thought, and very popular with them for doing so for some reason.
Indeed. But as an aside, I think that's a quite interesting point. We see a kind of imbalance of research done in academia, like Abduh and his students, like Rida, for example, are thoroughly studied. But very few people are even aware that only a few years after Abduh, it was nobody other than the Shaykh al-Islam of the Ottoman Empire himself, dedicating basically half of his life criticizing their positions. And it is not the case that Mustafa Sabri Effendi was a nobody, not at all. Like, he was well known in Turkey and in Egypt. He was teaching at Azhar, for example, and people were following his writings. But still, it is a kind of distorted picture we have nowadays in academia regarding the research done on these names. And I have to confess that even despite coming from the same culture, I got introduced to his works years and years later after I became familiar with Afghani, Abduh, and Rida. And I'm even someone who appreciates, like, let's say, and tries to benefit from traditional Islamic circles. And I'm very thankful to my teacher, Mardan Gunesh, who has introduced me to this topic. But it is like quite interesting that Sabri is not that known as he is supposed to be, I would say.
Can I just ask a question about your studies at Oxford very briefly? Is Sabri Effendi, obviously he'll be known about in academic circles in Oxford, but is he someone who is engaged with, is a serious thinker and taught and explained to students at all? Or
I'm not sure whether he's that known. That's the first point. The second one, I know that a historian actually has done a PhD on Sabri, and his work is going to be published, I think, even in November this year, by the name of Andrew Hammond. But this is exactly the problem I was referring to. I'm not sure what the publication contains, what he will say about Sabri, but it is again historic perspective and seems to maybe, I can imagine that it puts Sabri's political identity in the center without necessarily engaging much with his traditional scholarship. But I'm happy to read it and to have a look at it. So, right. But he's obviously not a philosopher or theologian like Andrew Hammond. He basically is an historian and has I can imagine, a very specific access to Sabri himself.
Yeah, which would be his political dimension then, rather than his,
Yeah, might be the case. So, but the point is, Sabri Effendi basically engages with Kant's philosophy with a certain depth, and he says also, he says التزمنا بعد التعمق في درسها, means that he has engaged with him quite with a kind of certain depth, and knowledge of Kant is mediated, at least mostly mediated, by an Ottoman translation of the French History of Philosophy that is written by Paul Janet in 1887. And it is sufficient to mention at this point that Sabri was familiar with most of Kant's essential philosophical assumptions. And we have quite a list of explicit topics in which Sabri critically engages with Kant, topics like the Copernican turn, the discrepancy between Kant's own claims and his reception, as you said, Kant's distinction of matter and form, or obviously the discussion on first principles, the discussion on the infinite regress, like tasalsul, as it is called in Arabic, Sabri's phenomenalist reading of Kantian ontology, Kant's transcendental idealism, and so on and so forth. So we have.
Will you be tackling these in some depth in the third?
Right. Right.
Otherwise, I will be asking you now about the Copernican revolution that Kant thought he unveiled now. But I'm not going to do that because I just find it so very interesting. But I'm going to delay this until the next time.
Right. I just wanted to show basically that Sabri is aware, what is going on, and has quite a few different things to discuss with Kant. And above all, obviously, all three proofs for God, like the ontological, the cosmological, and the teleological argument, and even the moral argument that Kant has established, all of them are subject to discussion in Sabri's work.
Excellent. Of course, the moral argument was Kant's own argument. One of his full existence of God, even though he's critiquing the famous arguments, the ontological. And so Kant did have arguments for the existence of God that he himself advocated, contrary to his reception, as you put it, of his thought, the impression of what he was about in the Kantian age in Western philosophy.
But, and that's, I think, an important point, there are also a lot of other topics where we do know both positions and just can complete the whole conversation that could not be continued due to the lack of sources and maybe even time. The best example is the issue of free will. Sabri has a separate work on this called موقف البشر تحت سلطان القدر, and we know also Kant's account on free will from different writings. And actually, not even only this, but all four antinomies of Kant can be discussed from Sabri's perspective just by saying or just by looking at the very specific discussions. And Kant's critique and Sabri's defense of occasionalism in particular would be another interesting discussion, and a bit more ambitious, and I would love to conclude with this. The conception of space and time is very important to Kant's philosophy, and Sabri only implicitly engages with it.
So this is found is discussed in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, this incredible work, where he discusses the nature of space and time and our apprehension of it and so on. So it's very important, fascinating subject.
But the important point here is there are a lot of, let's say, competing interpretations in Kant's time. And just to give an overview and to conclude with this, like we know, for example, that Cartesians, especially Descartes, has an accidental understanding of space and time, as far as I remember. But more important for us is like the Kalamic account on space and time that is relational, like Leibniz's account. And with a notable exception, we know that Fakhreddin al-Razi, the famous mutakallim, seems to have an absolute understanding of space and time, like Newton. That would be the third alternative, so accidental, relational, and absolute. And then Kant, who's operating with the Newtonian physics, obviously, as everybody else does in that very time, comes with a very radical solution and says that space and time are basically subjective. They are pure forms of intuition, which means that space and time, as things of themselves, even don't exist. And this is one of the most radical claims he makes, and something that has to be dealt with if somebody wants to systematize this discussion. And I think that's maybe a good point to stop, and more on all of this will be subject of our third round.
So just to summarize, in the third round, in the third video of this trio of videos, we'll be looking in much more substantial depth in the actual philosophy itself, these key concepts, occasionalism, causality, and so on, and Kant's thought, and Sabri Effendi's dialogue and critique of Kant, and so forth. So, but speaking for myself, this promises to be the most interesting of the three, actually getting into the actual content itself in some detail. So very much looking forward to that, Emir. And again, I thank you for your valuable time and your expertise. It's absolutely fascinating that there's this interaction between this interconnectedness between East and West. Eastern thought and Western thought is underappreciated clearly in our intellectual history, and you're making these contributions on YouTube is possibly unique. I don't know, but it's certainly extremely valuable, and I really do appreciate it, Emir.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure for me as well. Thank you very much.
Until next time, until the third time. Thank you.